Here in Nigeria, President Muhammadu Buhari says he intends to sign the Continental Free Trade Agreement reached by African leaders at a summit in Rwanda in March very soon. Mr. Buhari was speaking during a visit to Nigeria by South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa. Mr. Ramaphosa had earlier told Nigerian business leaders that South Africa sees huge benefits from the Continental Free Trade Deal and that the draft agreement relating to the movement of people has been reviewed. It was Mr. Ramaphosa's first visit to Nigeria since he became president in February. Let's get more on this story from an economist, Professor Emmanuel Nadozie, who joins us live from our Abuja studios. Thanks for joining us on Network Africa.
Thank you for having me.
Professor, are you optimistic that Nigeria will indeed sign the African Continental Free Trade Agreement soon?
Yes, I'm very optimistic and actually delighted that Nigeria has finally decided that it will sign this agreement that it has championed because during the preparations and the negotiations for the meeting that took place in March with the launch of the African Continental Free Trade Area, Nigeria was the lead, being the lead country that was helping with the negotiations. And so it was a bit of an embarrassment that in Kigali, Nigeria was not among the 44 countries that signed on to this very, very important initiative. And as you know, right now, there are 49 countries that have signed in, which is a very, very important landmark in the history of this continent. Although the ratification rate is not as high as it should be, because at this point in time, you only have six countries that have ratified. So I'm optimistic that Nigeria will sign this deal because it will bring tremendous benefits to the country.
So, Professor, tell us, how does a free trade area operate in theory?
Well, it's actually a simple phenomenon. You just have to remove all the duties that you have that is preventing people from trading with each other. It becomes a large and integrated market. And you know, one of the major problems for Africa is the fragmented markets that you have, which are of small size. And this is something that prevents people from taking advantage of the 1.2 billion people that are in the continent. So, for example, if everybody in the continent, the 55 countries, sign up to this, it means that a businessman or businesswoman in Nigeria, who probably would only be selling to 200 million people in this country, can now have a market size of 1.2 billion people, and they can ship their goods, sell them anywhere in the continent, and vice versa. So really, that's how the thing works, to really remove the trade barriers, and in particular the duties and taxes that affect free trade.
So what are the obstacles to its smooth implementation, in your own opinion?
Well, a very important question, because it's one thing to sign into this agreement. It's another thing to actually ratify it, because they need 22 countries to ratify it for this to become effective. And 2020 is the deadline they're looking at. But signing, ratifying is just the beginning of the issue. Implementing the Continental Free Trade Agreement is where the rubber meets the road. That's where the hard work and the heavy lifting has to take place. And I'm afraid that history does not present us with a good picture when it comes to this sort of arrangement. Because 17 years ago, under the former President Clinton in the United States, the AGOA program was launched to enable African countries to access the huge market of the United States. 17 years after, some countries, including Nigeria, have not been able to take advantage of the African Growth and Opportunities Act, that's AGOA. And so you begin to wonder, when we sign this and ratify it, are countries ready? Is readiness there to be able to implement it? Are Nigerian businesses ready to take advantage of this, to be able to sell to this huge market that is there? Do we have the manufacturing base that will be able to produce the goods and services that will be needed across the continent? Do we have the government services that will be leading this process, that will be providing the investment climate that will make businesses thrive? Do we have the right kind of capacity to make the policies that are necessary? I'm worried, but as an African capacity building organization, the ACBF have engaged with the Nigerian authorities to say that once they sign this deal, we're going to come in here and do an assessment of the readiness of this country to take advantage of the African Continental Free Trade Area. This will help us to see where the challenges are, both in the private sector and in the public sector and in other very important stakeholders, so that we can take action and not allow history to repeat itself.
So, Professor, how should African public and private sector institutions collaborate to benefit and develop this agreement?
Well, actually, the success or failure of this agreement will depend on partnerships and collaboration. And this is not just collaboration in name. It will be a narrow and very strong collaboration between the public sector and the private sector. The Ministry of Trade and Industry championing it, but there has to be a mechanism at the continental level, at the African Union level, the Secretariat for the African Continental Free Trade Area. But at the country level, there will be some sort of focal frameworks or institutions that should also be championing it at that level. And the job of these mechanisms would just be simply to help the coordination and the collaboration necessary. Because if the government and the private sector do not work together, it will be difficult for the benefits that are potential that can be gained from that to be maximized and to be harnessed. Because the public sector would listen to the private sector to understand the challenges and the obstacles that are preventing them to be able to produce the goods and services that they can trade across the continent. And vice versa, help them to open markets and help them to put in place the sort of policies that will be enhancing rather than inhibiting private sector operations.
So how can your organization, the African Capacity Building Foundation, help address the capacity issues at the fore of its smooth operation?
Yes, we have been in business for over 27 years, almost 28 years now. And we know a thing or two about capacity building in terms of human capacity and institutional capacity, because our job is really to help build skills that are critical for development and for transformation, and strengthen the key institutions that are at the forefront of making this happen. We will do that as far as the Continental Free Trade Area is concerned, operating at 3 levels. One is at the level of the continent, working very, very, very closely with the African Union Commission. As you know, ACBF is now a specialized agency of the African Union responsible for capacity building in the continent. So we will work closely together there, helping the advocacy that is needed, because we will have to push hard to get the 22 ratifications that are necessary. But we strengthen the Secretariat of the Free Trade Area to make sure it is properly set up and that it does its job. Then we will work with the regional economic communities that we have been, with whom we have very strong partnerships, because they have a key role to play in terms of mediation, in terms of coordination. I'll give you an example. One of the concerns of Nigeria is, this transshipment, importing rice through the neighboring countries, even though, indirectly. And Nigeria is right to be worried about that. But this is sort of the problem that can be solved at the ECOWAS level. And so we want to make sure that the capacity for dispute resolution and for negotiations are strengthened in those areas. But the most important area of intervention of ACBF will be at the country level. And I gave an example of what we can specifically do, working with the Afrexim Bank, working with the African Union Commission. I have already discussed with the authorities of the country to say we're ready to come here and do a readiness assessment. How ready is Nigeria to take advantage of this? And this will help us to use our tools to do a capacity needs assessment, which will help us to develop a strategy to help the country develop an African Continental Free Trade strategy that can help it to really maximize the benefits that come from it.
Professor Emmanuel Nadozie, thank you so much for joining us on Network Africa.
Thank you very much for having me.
Still to come on the program, Nigeria's amputee football team prepares for its World Cup debut in Mexico. Please stay with us.